What I've been tasked to do is to talk about the general topic of eschatology. What I want to do is address these things, end times. What do we mean by the issues of Christ's kingdom? When does it happen? When does the coming happen? And what about the tribulation? Those kinds of things. So we'll look at that. And I want to especially just lay out some of the building blocks. So some of you know all of this already, and you probably have a position. You've already worked through it. For those that haven't, maybe this will give you some opportunity to think through the options, if you will. Okay, so I like to start with this. Again, this is a very basic point. But when we talk about end, the word end is eschatos in Greek, so eschatology is the study of end times. The first thing to understand is the relationship of the kingdom to the coming of Christ. So that's a chronological discussion, right? Just simple chronology. So there is a view called, of course, premillennial eschatology. Premillennial refers, of course, to the coming of Christ before the millennium, right? Premillennial. And so basically you have, with this view, you've got the rapture that takes place. This is what we've heard about in the Left Behind series. In this case, the rapture features Kirk Cameron. And then we have 7-year tribulation, which also features Kirk Cameron. And then we also have the second coming proper, and then the period of time subsequent to that, which is the reign of Christ. So this millennial reign of Christ, where Christ, in this view, is reigning physically from Jerusalem. This is the premillennial dispensational view. And then the Armageddon at the end, which features Bruce Willis, of course, in this case, before the eternal state of new heavens and the new earth. And so that's sort of the timeline. The historic premill view also usually sees a future tribulation, which may or may not feature Kirk Cameron. And then oftentimes historic premills will say that the church goes through the tribulation. So essentially you don't get raptured out before that, left behind style. And then the same kinds of things happen. You have 1,000-year millennial kingdom with Armageddon battle at the end of it featuring Bruce Willis, and then finally the new heavens and new earth. Okay, so that's the premillennial chronology. Let's just compare that with the other chronology. So the two other positions we'll talk just a little bit about, and then I'll defend the one that I hold, is the amill view, the amillennial view, and the postmillennial view. You'll notice from the timeline here, the chronology is the same between the amillennial and postmillennial views. That is to say, the kingdom reign of Christ, which is not a literal 1,000 years according to these views, is happening from the ascension of Christ all the way through to the second coming of Christ. And then there is a second coming resurrection judgment event, and then the new heavens and the new earth. So you can see the chronology is the same between the amill and postmill view. So what's gives here? Well, the word premillennial, the word postmillennial have to do with chronology, right? The relationship of the coming of Christ to the kingdom. But when you say amillennial, the alpha privative, the A before a word, atheism, right? What does that mean? It means not believing in God. Amillennial means no millennium, which is to say there is no reign of Christ that affects the world and transforms it in some radical way. So if we put them all together here, the difference here is that with postmillennialism, you have the realized gradual incremental fulfillment of the Great Commission. So that's essentially how it looks, right? Another aspect of millennial chronology is that when you lay out your views, you have to take into consideration the tribulation. So you see in the top case, with premillennialism and dispensationalism, what's going on in terms of, quote, the Great Tribulation. So the tribulation is spoken of in passages like Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. A large part of the book of Revelation. So what do we say about that? Of course, premillennial dispensationalism says that's the first thing that happens when Christ raptures the church out. The 7-year tribulation happens, and Lots of icky stuff happens during that time, like a rise of an antichrist and a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem that then has to be destroyed and so forth. The post-mill view, as you see here, puts the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD as the tribulation. It puts that period of time that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24, those things happened to the generation to whom Jesus is speaking to. So I myself would hold this view that the tribulation is a past event. That's called preterism, the preterist view of the tribulation. So when you think through your choices eschatologically, you've got the chronology of the millennial kingdom. Okay, it's either pre or post, right? You've got the kingdom is, again, pre or post the coming of Christ. And you've got the character of the millennial kingdom. So the character meaning, does the millennial kingdom manifest visibly some transformation on the earth? And here we have an interesting correlation between on the chronological question, the amill and post-mill views are together. We have the same basic chronology. The kingdom is now, Jesus is reigning now, and Christ will come back. There will be a resurrection and judgment, and then there's the eternal state. With the pre-mill view, the kingdom is not now. We're waiting for that to happen. But in the case of the character of the millennial kingdom, actually, the pre-mill and post-mill views are agreed in that we believe the kingdom actually manifests in the world in such a way as to affect the world. So you see an interesting alignment on that. And then you have the chronology of the Great Tribulation, whether it's future or whether it's past. In this case, I'm holding that it is past. And so that character of the Great Tribulation, is it limited in duration? That would be like saying it's 7 years in the future. 7 years of time of tribulation in the future, limited. Or, like my view, it's years around the destruction of Jerusalem, past, but it's limited in time. Or, as amills tend to say, the Great Tribulation is a general and universal aspect of the entire kingdom age. So, a lot of amillennial types will say the whole of Christ's kingdom is a tribulation. Tribulation goes from the beginning of the reign of Christ all the way through to his second coming. There's no sort of non-tribulation time. Okay, so my view, let's talk about that. So I'm holding the postmillennial preterist view. So postmillennial meaning the chronology of the millennial kingdom in relation to Christ's coming, and specifically that it affects earth and manifests itself on earth, so there's transformation in the world. And the preterist view of the tribulation, meaning that it's a past event. Okay. Well, the character of the kingdom, as I've said, manifests fruit in the peace of men and civilizations. So, on the chronology and character of the tribulation, I'm just simply saying that it's a past event located in the fall of Jesus, or I like to call it the view that Jesus wins. That's what basically I'm saying. If Christ reigns, he's going to be effective in that reign. He gave us a command because he has all authority in heaven and on earth to disciple the nations. The post-mill preterist view says we can do that, and indeed are charged to do that. So that's the view I'm holding. Now let me prove it. Okay, that's just spelling out some of the options. Now let me lay it down. First order of business on this one is to find a passage in Scripture that addresses, ideally, the kingdom of Christ, the reign of Christ, and his coming, and tells us what the sequence is. Now, wouldn't that be great? So Christians, of course, disagree about these subjects, but what if there were a passage in the Bible that told us something is pre or post? What if there were a passage in the Bible that told us the sequence in words that are sequential? Well, as it turns out, there is a passage in the Bible that does that. It's 1 Corinthians 15. Now, I realize a lot of people, when they start to talk about the question of the millennium and millennial views, the first passage they turn to is what? Revelation 20, because that's where the term millennium is used, where the term 1,000-year reign is used. But Revelation, if you haven't noticed, if you've ever read Revelation, it is a difficult book. It has all kinds of images in it, has all kinds of figurative statements in it. Everyone acknowledges on all sides that it is one of the most difficult books to interpret in all of the Bible. John Calvin wrote commentaries on almost every book of the Bible, but not one on the book of Revelation. So, the point here is we want to find a passage that is clear in order to interpret the unclear passages. We don't want to leapfrog over everything in the Bible to get to some of the most murky passages in all of Scripture in order to say, this is where I'm going to, stake my stand. I'm going to start here. I'll give you one little anecdote from this. The last time I did a panel discussion on this subject, I was at Cairn University, Philadelphia Biblical University, and there was two premill representatives, dispensationalists, as well as a historic premill guy, and there was an amill representative, Vern Poythress from Westminster Seminary, and there was myself. And at some point in the evening, the moderator said, "Now everyone has hard passages. What are your hard passages? Give us a hard for your view. What's a hard passage?" And so everybody went around and said something. And I said, 2 Thessalonians, the man of sin passage is pretty hard. 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 and 2. Pretty tough passage, What does this mean? I think I know what it means, but I still think that's a really difficult passage. Well, Vern Poythress, who's a great guy and wonderful scholar, he started his presentation of proving amillennialism from that passage. So this is my hardest passage. This is the one he starts to prove his thing. And then when it came to him, he said, what was his hard passage? And it was the Great Commission. The Great Commission is hard for amillennialism because it seems like we can disciple the nations. It seems like Jesus is giving us a command that can be fulfilled because he has all authority in heaven and on earth. So I submit to you, it's better, I think, to start with the clear passages and move to the unclear passages rather than to start with the difficult passages and move to the ones that are manifest and stated in plain terms. So 1 Corinthians 15 then is the passage that one must look to because it is the only passage in the Bible which states something about the reign of Christ and something about the coming of Christ and uses terms that are sequential to relate the two. It's the only passage. You say, well, what about Revelation 19 and 20? Let's think about Revelation 19 and 20. Revelation 19 is when Christ is on a white horse, right? And his robe is dipped in blood, and a sword comes from his mouth, and various things happen. At the end of it, the beast is dead, and then birds come and eat up things. All right. A lot of people take that as the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ. Perhaps that is so. I don't think it is, but perhaps that is so. But the next chapter starts with the word, I think it's eidon, which in Greek, it's and I saw. That's the next phrase. It's not, and then this is what happened. It's not a sequential term. It's, and I saw, which may mean that Revelation 20 follows chronologically from Revelation 19. It may mean that, but it doesn't have to mean that in terms of the meaning of the words. There's no requirement that Revelation 20 tell us something that is happening after what's happening in Revelation 19. It may be, and a lot of interpreters think this, that Revelation 19 and 20 are picturing the same thing from different vantage points. Revelation 19 is talking about the triumph of the gospel on earth. This is B.B. Warfield's view, for example. And Revelation 20 is talking about the same period of time from the heavenly vantage point. And I saw those who were sitting on thrones and they reigned 1,000 years. From heaven, those that died, those that were beheaded. So at least that's a possibility. What I'm trying to say is, unless you have a passage that tells you the relationship, then we really don't have an exegetical basis for the chronology. So you can say, well, I think Isaiah 65 fits here in my chart. And I think, Psalm 2 fits here in my chart. But what we need is a passage that tells us the relationship for us to have the firm footing of saying we have an exegetical biblical basis. And thankfully we have that. Here it is, 1 Corinthians 15. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all shall be made alive, but each in his own order. Christ the firstfruits, after that those who are Christ at his coming. Then comes the end, when he delivers up the kingdom to the God and Father, and when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power. Now here's a very important statement. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that will be abolished is death. So what this passage does is it says, here's the problem, death. Remember the controversy in chapter 15 was resurrection. It says, here's the thing. Each, as in Adam, all will die, but in Christ all will be made alive, each in his own order. So he's giving us a sequential word. Actually, the word is tagma, I believe. Each in his own order. Christ the firstfruits, that's when he's resurrected. In other words, Christ is resurrected. After that, okay, there's a sequential idea. Those who are Christ at his coming. You see that? Christ is resurrected. Then at the coming of Christ, everyone else is resurrected. Then comes the end, when he delivers up the kingdom to the God and Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power. Now, the word when there is best translated, and I think it is translated in the ESV, after. It's a specific kind of clause in the Greek language, and it means after. Then comes the end, after he delivers up the kingdom to the God and Father, after he has abolished all rule and all authority and power. Basically, this abolition of rule, authority, and power has happened when he delivers up the kingdom to the Father. Now there's an explanatory phrase. For he must reign until he puts all his enemies under his feet. So the reigning is happening, okay? They know that. And notice the last statement. The last enemy that will be abolished is death. Now why is that relevant? Because he's talking about resurrection. So when will the last enemy be abolished? At the resurrection. When those that are Christ's are also raised from the dead. You say, well, I don't quite see it. Well, okay, let's keep working on it here. Let me just notice at the rest of the chapter, toward the end, he's discussing resurrection, the whole thing. He gives the famous, if you will, language of rapture. I tell you a mystery, we will not all sleep, we all will be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So this is rapture language, just like 1 Thessalonians 4. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, this mortal must put on immortality. But when, notice time word here, when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? In other words, there is a then to when death is overcome. And what is that then? Well, that's what the whole chapter is about. Resurrection. The resurrection, if you would call it, the resurrection of the righteous and the unrighteous, the Bible teaches everywhere. So let me go a little bit more on the proof of the postmillennial order here. Here we have the chronological sequence of the reign of Christ in relation to his coming with terms that specify this. The end is precisely when he delivers up the kingdom to the God and Father, and at the time after he has abolished all rule and all authority and power. Paul teaches that the kingdom is consummated at the end, that is his coming. This is not when the kingdom begins, contra premillennialism. Further, contra amillennialism, his victory does not happen all at once. His abolition of rule, authority, and power of his enemies has taken place prior to the end. That's what I'm pointing out, the specific Greek phrase here, the subjunctive aorist construction of that clause, when this happens. The correct translation is after he has abolished all rule, authority, and power. So, the last eschatos enemy, that is, the last enemy is death, is overcome at the resurrection, at his coming. then his reign is prior to resurrection. Hence, there can't be another 1,000 years of enemies after this. Now, let me just point this out. So the premillennial conception of the kingdom, whether you're historic premill or dispensational premill, what is going on in the millennial kingdom? There are people in the world that are being ruled over by Jesus from Jerusalem, physical presence of Jesus in Jerusalem. And these people may follow Jesus and believe, and many will, according to the premill view. But some, and these are natural people that can die. This is where you get all these prophecies fulfilled of a person who dies at 100 will be thought to be dying very young and this kind of thing. But these are mortal people that Christ rules over. They can die. They cannot believe. And in fact, at the end of it, a whole horde of them gather around and try to besiege Jerusalem with Jesus Christ on the throne. So through the millennial kingdom of the premill view, what is happening? Well, among other things that are happening, death is happening. Not maybe a lot of it, but some of it. But 1 Corinthians 15 says the last enemy that's overcome is death, and that is overcome at the resurrection. Now remember, premill folks believe the second coming of Christ is the resurrection too. We all agree with that. The second coming of Christ involves the resurrection of believers and unbelievers before whatever else happens next. So, again, premillennial chronology simply is ruled out by a careful reading of 1 Corinthians 15, 22 and following. Secondly, Paul expresses this reign in verse 25 in a paraphrase of Psalm 110:1. Sit at my right hand, that is to reign, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And the Bible is clear when this reign began. Do you see it? He must reign till he puts all his enemies on his feet. The last enemy is death. When did the reign begin? Does it begin in the future millennial kingdom? No. It began when he sat down at the right hand of God. Now, how do we know that's happened? Because the Bible says so about 20 times. Christ is currently at the right hand of God, the Father. This is stated at the end of Mark. After he spoke these things, he sat down at the right hand of God. Just many verses. Romans 8:34, Ephesians 1:20, Colossians 3:1, Hebrews 1:3. It's in Hebrews about 7 times actually. 1 Peter 3:22. First sermon that Peter preaches when he gets up on Pentecost, he says, David didn't ascend into the heavens, but Jesus did, and he's sitting at the right hand of the Father. So we know when the reign began. What do we know about the end of the reign? The last enemy's death. That's at the resurrection. Okay, so though Christ is ruling in the midst of his enemies now, that's what Psalm 110:2 says, his reign, according to Paul, will overcome all of his enemies. So what's that about? Well, remember, there are people that have the same chronology on mills that I do, but they say the world's getting worse. It could be up and down. We never know. There's nothing really we can predict about it, except that here, Paul says, he must reign until he's put all his enemies under his feet. So, 1 Corinthians 15, and I think many other verses, make it clear that the kingdom will be demonstrably victorious. So that's the post-mill part. Now, a lot of my friends that don't like the label post-millennial will say, I'm not a dispensationalist, I'm not premillennial, I'm amillennial, but I'm very optimistic. Okay, well, that's fine. So you say, well, how optimistic? Well, just say the Bible says he must put all his enemies under his feet. That's how optimistic Paul is about it. So we probably should adjust our optimism to the Bible's optimism. That's basically proof of the post-mill order. Let me move to the other thing that I think is very significant, and that is the tribulation itself and why that's significant. So here's the Arch of Titus in Rome. I took this picture myself. Titus became a Roman emperor. He was the son of Vespasian, who was the first Roman emperor following the Julio-Claudian line. He started to squelch the uprisings of the Jewish revolt in 67 AD. He got called back to go to Rome to become the next emperor, which was a big change, by the way, and I believe Revelation actually addresses that in some places. But Titus finished the job in Jerusalem, and in 70 AD, the whole city was destroyed, especially the temple. And so what we have here is the interpretation of Jesus' Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24. All these things will take place before this generation passes away. This is literally written in stone. You can see this in Rome today. This is the picture of the Jewish treasures being taken out, the booty, if you will, from Jerusalem being taken out, including the menorah, which came out of the temple. They destroyed the temple. There was so much gold in it that Romans literally took picks and hammered and broke the stones to get the melted gold, which it had been on fire. And so they literally busted up the rocks all around in order to get the gold, the precious metals that had melted down to go in. But they took a number of artifacts out, and here you have it. This is the picture of the destruction of Jerusalem that takes place. This is what I believe is being discussed in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21. Flavius Josephus was a Jewish priest and a Pharisee. He was put in command of the national resistance in Galilee at the time of Israel's revolt against Rome, but was captured. His life was spared, and he predicted something about Vespasian becoming the emperor. And so essentially, Vespasian took him along for the ride while he mopped up the other Jewish part of the revolt across the land there. And Josephus becomes persuaded that this is really Israel's really off base, and this Jewish revolt shouldn't be happening. And so he literally pleads outside of the walls of Jerusalem for the Jews to come out and stop this revolt. Inside the city of Jerusalem, a number of factions had taken place. And here's the thing about this particular destruction of Jerusalem and how this factors in to biblical prophecy. The city of Jerusalem was a well-fortified city. It's very high. It's a couple thousand feet above sea level. To go from Jericho to Jerusalem is like climbing up a mountain 3,000 feet tall. They had enough grain and water supplies. I think they have an internal well. They had enough grain and food supplies to last for a siege of 10 years. So the idea that Rome or anybody else could come and, siege warfare, you gather around, you put up all these different things, you try to bust in, but a lot of siege warfare in the ancient world was just, you starve them out, you get around them, they can't go out, they can't come in, they can't get food, they die of starvation. What do you do with a city that has 10 years supply of food for those inside of it? How are you going to win that one? You're going to have a 10-year-long siege? Say, well, hey, it didn't last 10 years, did it? No, it didn't. It lasted a few months. Why? Because inside the city, the key leaders, the Jewish zealots that were leaders, the key leaders began to fight amongst themselves. And somebody had the good idea of setting the food stuff on fire. So they destroyed themselves by their going after each other. And that's why the Romans could win this siege. Because internally in the city, these zealot, anti-Christian, Jewish, seditious leaders turned against one another and fought. So Josephus is a tremendous read if you want to read the Jewish Wars by Josephus. So tremendous read. Again, written by a guy who knew very well. He himself was a priest. He himself was one of the military leaders. But then he turned and said, you know what? Rome's got a point here. And in fact, writes it up sort of blow by blow, just like, you had, name your favorite news anchor right there watching the whole thing go down. And he pleads with them to come out. And Josephus may be biased at this point, but he really represents Vespasian and Titus as very even-handed and very gracious leaders that are trying to say, we don't want to destroy the city. We don't want to destroy the temple. Come out and fight us out here so we do not do violence to this tremendous city and this temple. I mean, this is pleading over and over again. Because as it turns out, here's how significant the temple was for the first century. It was the largest man-made building on earth at the time. As you approached it in Jerusalem, the description is, it looks like a gleaming white jewel because of its tremendous beauty and size. It was a wonder. When the rebellion took place, it was on Passover, so there were all these pilgrims in. So people have estimated, Josephus says more than 1 million people died in the siege of Jerusalem. 1 million. Now, people say, well, that's too many. But there certainly were close to that because there was already 100,000 people in it in the first place. So, you get a pilgrimage time, you're going to get a lot more. So it's a tremendous event. Jesus himself he just lays it right out. Right before the Olivet Discourse, let me give you one example of this. I'll read a passage for you, which I think is significant. Just give you a sense of why this shows up in prophecy, and I'm going to end with this. So when Jesus is entering into the temple, or entering into the city in his last time, when he gets there, he has excoriated the religious leaders. This is the passage where it says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, right? You know that passage. And then at the end of this, he says, therefore, he says, I'll just read a few verses from Matthew 23:29. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then, listen to this language, fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some of whom you will scourge in your synagogues. Please notice, it's not applied to today. Nobody's scourging people in synagogues today. And persecute you from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous bloodshed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. And you say, that's a pretty harsh judgment, Jesus, on this one place, this one time. Why? Well, do you think this was a justified warning of judgment from Jesus? I mean, what did they do after all? Well, among other things, they killed Jesus. They crucified Jesus. They crucified the Son of God. That's why Jesus is laying it on hard. All of the righteous bloodshed on earth will go to you. And then he says, verse 36, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon the generation that lives after World War II into the 1970s. No. To this generation. It has to be this generation, right? It's the group he's talking to. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophet and stones those who are sent to her. How often I would have wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus came out of the temple and was going away. When his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him, and he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left standing on another which will not be torn down. And then they ask him, well, wait, tell us when this is going to happen. And this is what starts the Olivet Discourse. And in the middle of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus himself says, after saying lots of things about signs and various other things, he simply says, all these things, once again, will come upon this generation. So, or actually, verse 34 of Matthew 24. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So this is, I think, a pretty important concept to get down in terms of understanding biblical prophecy, that the conclusion of this is simply that Jesus reigns, that's what is promised in the kingdom. The language about an imminent destruction or judgment that we find in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels, refers to this event. In the booklet, I have a section of text that people have pointed out sometimes. Well, look at all these texts that say things are going from bad to worse, or evil men are rising, or we're in the last days. And I deal with that. We can deal with that in the objection, question, answer time, or anything like that. But let me just point out that if you have the preterist understanding of the tribulation, when you see text in the New Testament that say something is about to happen of destruction, well, what was that? It was this. It was the events that we just talked about. So then if you say, okay, well, every text that says something is about to happen of an imminent nature, they all fall very neatly into the first century judgment on Jerusalem. Beyond that, we talk about the kingdom and what Christ is doing and where Christ is seated and his commandment for us to go forth and to disciple the nations. All of that is the kingdom that really flows out of that very time period. So, in other words, the optimistic texts of the Bible are all about the kingdom of Jesus, kingdom of reign of Christ. The texts that deal with signs of the times, or that, this generation is not going to pass away, literally, that was true. Literally, this generation didn't pass away before this tremendous destruction happened. And it was a world upheaval. It was not just an upheaval of Jerusalem, because remember, what happened to bring this about? Well, there was a big revolt that took place across Palestine. At the same time, this is coming right up to the end of the line of Caesars, from Julius Caesar to Nero. Nero, of course, goes nuts and does some horrible things and kills Christians and so forth. It's right in the middle of the 60s. Then he sends Vespasian to go deal with the Jewish revolt. Vespasian, after the year of 3 emperors, as it's called, where Nero kills himself and 2 others all rise up, and now that's kind of over. Vespasian, who's he would not have been considered an emperor. Nobody would have ever had him be emperor 10 years before this. But at this point, now everything's up for grabs. So the most powerful military general gets the job, and that's Vespasian in this case. So you have this world change. If you can imagine it, I've tried to come up with political analogies from today, but they're not going to sound great. But just imagine this, that you have this line of presidents. Let's say they're all named Bush, for example. And they're going along just fine, and you get to the last one, and he sends over, let's just say, Colin Powell to go deal with all the stuff over here in a far land away like Iraq or something. And in the middle of this long line of Bush presidents, suddenly the last one goes crazy and kills himself. And then Colin Powell comes back and takes the presidency away. And then his sons become the next line of emperors. That's what happened. There's this big world shakeup, not only in Jerusalem, but also in Rome, where people could not fathom this. So a lot of things took place, but Jesus' words are specifically focused on what happens to Jerusalem and the judgment that's coming to them in this deal. So I'm going to stop there. I think we're going to take a break, and then we'll come back, and you can have at me with all kinds of questions and answers and discuss the issue of eschatology. My final statement would be, you see, if the imminent destruction judgment language of the New Testament is fulfilled in the first century, which I believe it is, and if the kingdom language of Jesus is he must reign till he's put all his enemies under his feet, then Jesus is not coming back soon, because he's got more enemies to put under his feet. There's more kingdom development and transformation to go. So someone asked me once, do you think, can Christ come back at any time? In the past, I have said, I think, yeah, he could come back at any time. But now I would say, certainly Christ can do whatever he wants to do. So we're not bound by that. I may be mistaken about my interpretation of the Bible. But in as much as I'm confident in my interpretation of the Bible, specifically 1 Corinthians 15, 25, for he must reign until he puts all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy is death. There are more enemies out there, are there not? There's more conquering to do. There's more nations to be discipled, are there not? There's more evil rulers to be put down. There's more glorification and revival and transformation of the world through Christian people raising up godly institutions. We've seen a lot of it. Slavery's been abolished officially. Lots of good things have happened over 2 millennia. Many nations have been converted. We have more than 1 billion people naming the name of Jesus, but it's not over yet. So from my reading of the promise that he'll put all his enemies under his feet, and that he has the power to do it, and that the nations are to be discipled. From my reading of that, we're not done yet. So I still believe that there's time to go. How long? Can't predict that. No way to do that. Can't quantify that. But could Christ come back tomorrow if my reading of this is right? No, because all of his enemies are not under his feet, and he promised a sequential long time of transformation. The nations would be discipled. There are nations that don't have the gospel. So I'd say, I believe we are looking at digging in for the long haul. I think that's the best way to read it. As I said, with the humble admission of, hey, I could be mistaken in my reading, but according to the reading, we would expect a long time of Christ's reign through the gospel, with the church being commanded to go forth and disciple the nations. So, Jesus is not coming soon. Now, with that, let me say one other word. Jesus is not coming soon, if I'm right, but you may soon go to him. So it doesn't remove the immediacy of you being right, because the world won't end. The world didn't end, for the last, 1900 years, the world didn't end. Did that mean people didn't go to meet their Maker? No, of course not. So even if Jesus is not coming for 50 years, let's say, then you may go to him in 50 years, or less, or the next hour. We don't have control of that. So Jesus may not be coming soon, but you may be going to him soon. So you better be right with the King who rules from the throne.